Hey guys, Mrs. Yeagle again, and I'm here to read chapter 32 of Addison Cooke and the Tomb of the Khan. This chapter is called The Templar Medallion. The van rumbled deeper into downtown, passed through a security gate, and entered the private garage of an enormous mansion. Who left Addison's team locked in the back of the van for an hour before finally releasing them? He hustled across the palace grounds. Addison admired the beautiful sloping eaves of the buildings and the tastefully manicured gardens that hemmed the perimeter wall. He realized this was an old estate and that the modern city had simply grown up around it. Hu guided the group through the palace foyer and into a magnificent great room where Madame Feng reclined on a couch and sipped tea by a roaring fire. Addison could not imagine the need for a roaring fire in the middle of July, but then he could not really imagine the need for living in a palace either. Still, the room was magnificent, with Manchurian weaponry, Mongolian tapestries, and Ming Dynasty vases. "I love your home," said Addison with genuine feeling. "Thank you." Madame Feng sipped her oolong. "I love Mongolia and keep this as my summer home. My family traces its lineage all the way back to Genghis Khan, so I feel a great affinity for this country. Besides, I have many business interests in Ulaanbaatar." "You mean with the triads? I've read there are plenty of gangs operating in this city. Are you familiar with Babatunde Okohono's Mission Survival?" Madame Feng fixed Addison with a stare so cold it risked freezing her steaming tea. "In the morning, I am taking your aunt and uncle north. The Russians have the lance and my spies are trailing them." She leaned forward on her sofa, addressing Addison like a close friend. "Addison, neither one of us wants to see Boris get his hands on the Khan's treasure. If there is anything you can tell me about Sir Frederick's latest clue, you must tell me now." "I'm sorry," said Addison, who would sooner remove his own appendix with a rusted spoon than share information with Madame Feng. "We don't know anything." Madame Feng's feline eyes narrowed. "Can I trust you to tell me the truth?" "Absolutely." Addison gave her a trust-me grin that would make a used car salesman blush. Madame Feng had her teacup out for a servant to refill. The fire crackled and roared as a log collapsed in a spray of sparks. "Genghis Khan trusted Inalachuk, one of the governors of Persia. He sent his diplomats to visit the country with a caravan of gifts. Inalchuk executed the entire caravan." Addison was not entirely sure where Madame Feng was going with this, but he loved a good story. She sipped her tea and continued. "Genghis Khan did not suffer fools gladly. He traveled to Persia at the head of his army. He burned every city to the ground. When he reached Nishapur, he slaughtered 2 million Persians in a single day. His warriors built pyramids out of the skulls and laid them where the cities once stood. When Genghis finally captured Inalchuk, he murdered him by pouring molten silver into his eyes and ears." It was not the best story Addison had ever heard, but he sensed Madame Feng was winding up to her point. She carefully set her antique teacup down in its saucer and rose to her feet. "This palace contains a dungeon. You will stay there until you tell me everything you know about Sir Frederick's clue. If you do not talk by tomorrow morning, I am going to pour molten silver down your lying throats." Addison gulped with his lying throat. Molly used hers to speak. "You talk about trust, but you lied to Eustace and you lied to my aunt and uncle. You kidnapped them and they didn't do anything to you. Madame Feng, you are shifty, underhanded, and two-faced." Madame Feng's eyes glittered. "You say that like it's a bad thing. You know, I think you really are related to Genghis Khan." "Thank you." "Wasn't a compliment," said Molly.
Presley and Drake Hardesty, please come to the office.
Addison wasn't sure whether Molly should be provoking their captor. Perhaps Madame Feng had the fire roaring in case she felt a hankering to start melting down some silver right away. He took a step forward. "Madame Feng, I will consider your request, but first I must speak to my aunt and uncle." Molly was shocked. "Don't tell her anything, Addison." Addison kept his gaze locked on Madame Feng. She smiled, showing her perfect teeth. I see you do have information to share after all. Very well, Addison. You may spend a few minutes with one of them, but only one. To Addison's pleasure, it was Tony Chin who walked him down to the dungeon. They followed winding stone passages through the kitchen and down into a cellar. Once out of earshot of Madame Feng, Addison peppered Tony with questions. Is she really going to torture us, Tony? Probably, Tony admitted. She'll do whatever it takes to find the Khan's tomb. Do we have any chance of getting out of here? Not really. I'm sorry, Addison. Well, said Addison, feeling the need to get one up on Tony, we've been using your credit card. Of course you have. How do you think we tracked you to Ulaanbaatar? You used a credit card 3 blocks from the museum. Addison frowned. Now he understood how the Triads had found him. Why do you help her? When I was a teenager, I swore an oath to the Triads. Madame Feng controls a branch of our group. She's very powerful. I read about the Triads. Hundreds of years ago, before the Triads were criminals, they were freedom fighters. They wanted to overthrow the Qin dynasty. Do you remember the oaths you took? Of course. I vowed loyalty, honor, justice, fealty, and respect. Tell me, said Addison, did you vow to rob and beat up children? Is that in your code of honor? Tony hesitated. He ducked through a cellar door and into the low stone hallway that led to the dungeon cells. You started it when you took my wallet. You started it when you took my aunt and uncle. Tony lit a candle, melted some wax with the match, and stuck it in a wall sconce carved into the rock. He guided Addison into an empty cell and locked the iron grill shut. He looked at him through the bars. You saved my life at the Thousand Buddha Caves. Why? In the dim light, Addison could see that Tony's face was still swollen with bruises from his tangle with the Russians. I live by a code as well. Tony nodded. I will give you a minute alone with your uncle. He reached into his pocket and handed Addison his butterfly knife. Thank you for saving my life. He turned away, leaving Addison in the flickering candlelight of the dungeon. Now there are those dots on the page, which means there's a page break. So we're going to change setting, we're going to change time, maybe a little bit of perspective. So think about that as we come back for the next section.